Hello everybody, in this tutorial we're going to be taking a closer look at how you can export your Corona scenes and open them up in Vantage. So with Corona 12, what you can now do is you can export your scenes so that you can open them up in Vantage. Vantage is a real-time renderer, which means you get instant feedback when working in the scene, although obviously that does come at the cost of realism. Ultimately, this new workflow allows you to do various things, like, for example, you can do very quick previews, aka previs tasks, and this includes both still images as well as animations. You can also quickly discover new viewpoints because of the real-time component, and you can also make changes to your scene as far as Vantage allows it. Ultimately, if you so wish, you can also use Vantage to render out final images or animations. Although again, because Vantage is a real-time renderer, you can't quite expect ultimate realism from it. Now, this is a feature that a lot of you wanted, and it's also the first time that we're introducing the ability for you to move your scenes from Corona and into Vantage. So this release for us has been mainly focused on the fundamentals of the export process. We do plan on improving it in the future with future Corona versions. Because right now there are some limitations, because this release, again, for us, it was focused mainly on the fundamentals of the export process, make sure that the basic most things get carried over into the Vantage scene properly. Some things are not supported yet, like for example, exporting animations from your DCCs, etc., but we are going to be working on that in future Corona versions. Now, the actual workflow when it comes to exporting your scenes is really straightforward. You just need to go into your render settings under the system menu and then just hit one of the export buttons. We're going to talk about what the export buttons do in more detail later on, but for the most part, that's really all you have to do. Now, before we dive any deeper into the workflow, let's maybe spend a couple of minutes, getting acquainted with Vantage. So Chaos Vantage is an extremely capable real-time ray tracing renderer, which means it runs in real time like a video game does, for example. So basically you get instant visual feedback as you work in it. Now, as stated, Vantage supports ray tracing, which means that with it you can output highly realistic imagery or animations. Now, yes, it does not offer the quality that Corona offers in terms of realism, but on the flip side, it does calculate the image faster. And so it really depends on what kind of output you need at that point in time for your project. So one that is more focused on quality, or one that is speedier to render out at the cost of realism. Now, even though Chaos Vantage runs on consumer hardware, so your typical CPUs and your typical gaming GPUs, etc., it can still render really complex scenes really efficiently. Much like the example you see in front of you right now. This was rendered in Vantage. Now, Vantage does have some minimum requirements, and any sort of decently modern CPU will do, but then you also need to make sure that your GPU, your graphics card, is DXR supported. So that's basically the minimum requirement. You need to kind of check off the checklist if you want to use Vantage. Okay, and so with that, we are ready to start looking into the workflow. So how do you get your Corona scenes to open up in Vantage? And then what are some of the things you can do with those scenes in Vantage? That's what we're going to be taking a look at next here. Okay, so we are in 3ds Max here. We have our Corona scene open. And so now how do we get this thing into Vantage? Well, it's all rather simple. You just need to go under the render settings. Okay, and then under the system menu, and then you're going to be able to see that you have these 3 buttons here that you can use to export this scene out. Now, we're not going to talk about export plus render and render in Vantage just yet. These 2 buttons are really awesome, but for now, we're just going to export this scene using the export scene button. Okay, and we're going to want to make sure that the file type is not set to Corona scene here, but we want it to be set to V-Ray scene or the VR scene file type. Okay, we're not going to use the Vantage one. We're going to talk about why later on. You're going to be able to use it if you want to, but for now, the most prudent option for us is going to be the V-Ray scene file, okay? So now what we want to do is we just want to name this thing properly. So let's call it the modern interior export or something like that. And let's hit save. And now the exporting will start, and we're going to just fast forward this part so you don't have to wait for this process to finish. Okay, so the export process finished for us here. We also opened up Chaos Vantage, and this is sort of the greeting menu that you're greeted with anytime you open Chaos Vantage. And so now what we can do is we can just hit open file here, and we need to make sure we're in the correct folder, right? And we can just open up that VR scene file that we exported earlier. We just select it, hit open, and give Vantage a second or two to load up. All right, there you go. It loaded up for us here, and we're already in action. As you can see, we are in Vantage now. We can move around in our scene in real time. And so, yeah, that's really all that is needed to export a scene, a Corona scene, into Vantage. Maybe just a bit of a quick note on how the cameras import. So the only camera that's going to come from your DCC into Vantage is going to be your active viewport camera. Okay, so that's what we got here, where it says original camera. That's our active viewport camera from the DCC. That's the only one that gets transferred over into Vantage. Okay. Okay, now what we're going to do next here is we're going to do a bit of an overview of basically so what the basics of Vantage are and what are some of the things you can do in Vantage as well. Okay, but with that said, we do strongly suggest you watch the relevant Vantage tutorials and read the relevant Vantage documentation that we have available on Chaos Docs because, you know, this is not a fully fledged Vantage tutorial, but we do want to give you basic idea of how things work in Vantage. So one thing that you can do in Vantage is, for example, you can select your select tool, select one of the objects in your scene, and then just use the move tool to move it around. You can also scale things up using the scale tool. Let's just move this thing so that it doesn't intersect with the countertop there. And then you can also, you know, rotate things around. So you have the ability to do that in Vantage. And what you also have the ability to do in Vantage is play with the lighting. So we're using a Corona Sun and Sky system to light up the scene. And as you can see, if we go under the Environment tab here, we have the ability to tweak the Corona Sky and Sun parameters, or some of them. Okay, so if we wanted to decrease the sky's intensity, we can do that, right? We can change the sky type. So if you're used to using a different sky type, you can do that. For the environment mode, you can use HDRIs, you can use solid colors. So all that is supported in Vantage. And then obviously you can also control the sun as well. You can lower its intensity, you can make the sun more intense, etc., etc. So you have these options available in Vantage as well, including clouds, and you can also enable some fog in your scene if you so want to, right? And then you also have all these other settings here. And again, we would encourage you to watch all the Vantage tutorials that we have available. Next up, what you can also do, now that the scene is in Vantage, you can play around with the lights themselves. So let's maybe focus on this light right here. We're going to select it, and then we're going to go under the lights tab. Okay, as you can see, we have our light lister here. It works in the compact mode, the basic mode, and also the advanced mode. We're not going to worry about that too much. But what we are going to do here is we're just going to locate this light that we have selected here. It's the living TV light, okay? And so we're just going to play with its radiance. So we're going to increase its intensity, right? Or we can also decrease it if we so want to. We can, you know, turn this light into a disc light. We can change its width, height, and we can also play with its directionality, right? So now it's a lot more directional, right? So we have all those things that you can do here. And then, you know, you can play around with your cameras as well. So let's say you wanted to get a little bit closer to the countertop here. Okay, so maybe you like this particular angle right here. Okay, so what you can do is you can create a new camera by clicking on the camera plus icon here. Okay, and then as you can see, you've created a new camera, which, you know, you can rename if you so want to. And now if you want to switch back to the original camera, you can just click on the thumbnail here. Or, you know, if you want to go back to camera one, you can click on the camera one thumbnail. That's going to switch between the two. If you would like to update this camera's position and rotation, etc., you can just make sure that you are in this camera by having the thumbnail be selected. And then you rotate things around, you reposition them, and you hit this update button. And now your camera has updated, as you can see by looking at the thumbnail here, right? Then you also have some camera options that you can play around with here. So you can change the field of view, right? You can also change the lens mode, so you can play, so you can have the field of view be replaced by the focal length, right? If this is a little bit more easier to to work with for you. Okay, kind of depends on which workflow you like better, but both do the same thing. You can then also play with the motion blur. You can enable it. You can enable depth of field. And if you're working with, exterior arc-viz type scenes, you'll really appreciate the automatic vertical tilt correction that you can just enable here by clicking this button. As you can see, that's going to straighten out those vertical lines for you, right? Okay. Then you can also switch over to the color correction tab. All right. Here you have all of your basic color corrections. So the VFB stack in Corona doesn't get translated over into Vantage. So your exposure, your LUTs and all that, you're going to have to set them up in Vantage again. All right. So you can control the exposure, right, of your camera. And then what you can do is you can also enable filmic tone mapping. Okay. And you have two different types. You have Hable and you have Ampus, at least in this version of Vantage. And you can also play with your LUTs. You can, put your LUT file in here. You can decide how strongly it will get applied. You have your bloom controls, your hue and saturation, color balance, etc., etc. So you have all these color correction modifiers, if you will, that you can tweak here. Okay. Now, if you're totally unfamiliar with Vantage, there's one important thing you do have to know, and that is that Vantage does not give you the ability to tweak the materials from inside of Vantage. If you would like to tweak the materials, you will need to go back into your DCC, make the changes there, and then re-export the scene. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't do anything material related in Vantage. So if you go under the material tab here, you're going to be able to see all the materials that got imported that are in the scene. You're going to be able to see them in thumbnail fashion right here. And so what you can now do with these materials is you can, for example, select this countertop here, and you can just right click on one of the material thumbnails and you can select this, assign this material to the selection button. And now, as you can see, we've assigned this selection, well, we've assigned this material to our selection, right? But let's undo that because we quite like the marble top here. And another thing you can do in Vantage is you can use Cosmos assets and import those into the scene. So for example, we have a wood material here we're going to bring in into Vantage, okay, by hitting the import button. So the regular Cosmos workflow applies here. And now if we just scroll down here, you can see that this is the material that we've imported. We're going to select the countertop here. We're going to right click on the material and we're going to assign this material to the selection. And as you can see, now we have this Cosmos material on our table here, right? But again, let's undo that because the marble countertop looks pretty cool. Oh, and Nate's from the future here, by the way. Before we forget, you can also obviously just drag and drop these materials onto your objects. You don't always have to right click and assign this material to this selection this way. Okay, you can just drag and drop things, just so you know. Nate's from the future signing off for now. Now, another thing to note for when it comes to working with materials in Vantage is that you cannot change the mapping mode in Vantage. Okay, so when you export your Corona scenes, make sure that the mapping is set correctly and that it exports correctly into Vantage, because you can't change the way things are mapped in Vantage. Cool. So that takes care of the actual material workflow. You also have this clay mode here, just in case you're interested in seeing everything in clay mode. Really useful if you need it. But that's pretty much it for when it comes to the actual materials. Okay, so now before we conclude this sort of basic overview of Vantage, let's also go into the object tab here. And in here, you can just see all of the objects that are in your scene, and you can also select them. So for example, let's select this a snooker table light. Okay, we can just click on it in the lister, and as you can see, it's selected in our scene. So this is a very DCC-esque workflow that you're dealing with here. All right, so that kind of is the very basic overview of how Chaos Vantage sort of works. Now, again, we would really like to encourage you to read up on the Chaos docs about Vantage and look at other tutorials that explain the basics if you're not familiar with them, because this is not a Vantage tutorial necessarily, but we do want to give you something to get started with, without actually going into deep into things. Now, with all this sort of explained, let's talk a little bit about rendering in Vantage. So you get access to render settings by going under the render settings tab here, and you have all these sort of typical settings that you might want to tweak here. So you can play with the GI, how many bounces it does. You can flat out disable GI, so that's global illumination. You got your material bounces settings, etc., etc. Now, noise threshold here, probably one of the most important settings. It basically defines when the rendering stops, so it works pretty much the same as the noise limit in Corona. Now, if your viewport here is, if you feel like upping the quality on it, you can change the DLSS mode here from performance to DLAA. Okay, DLAA, you can, hopefully you can kind of see the frame rate dropped a little bit. It's still real time, but the frame rate has dropped a little bit. And the quality is, just overall higher, even when I'm moving in the viewport. So there is that. But then, what you can do is you can also, render things out of Vantage. And so to do that, you can click on this render button down here, and the render setup window is going to pop up. So you have your typical settings right here on the right. You can select your cameras, your scene states, etc., etc. You can decide if you're going to have motion blur. You get your resolution settings, your quality settings, so how many samples you want to throw at this image. So higher samples naturally mean longer render times, but also things are going to look better. And when we say better, we mean less noisy and more temporally stable. One important thing to note at this point is that this toggle keep desktop responsive. You typically want this to be checked to on, because if you're gonna render and you want to do other work on the computer, and if you have this toggle to off, you're probably not going to get much work done. So you want to keep this to on whenever you plan on using the computer when you're rendering out of Vantage. Okay, and then you can choose to have render elements in here. You can set them up any way you'd like to with the setup menu. And then also you can define where things get saved. Now, what you can also do is you can add renders to the render queue just by clicking on this button right here, and then you can add as many render queues as you want. And ultimately, you can also render sequences or animations out of Vantage. But at the moment, this button, if we click on it, nothing will really happen because it's grayed out, because we don't have really any animations set up. Okay, and as you've probably guessed, we're going to be talking about animations next here. And one big thing to note here is that the current Vantage support that we have in Corona 12, with Corona 12, is a little bit more fundamental. Okay, so we don't quite support everything that we would like to support just yet, and that includes exporting animations from your DCC tools. Okay, so when you export your Corona scene and import it into Vantage, you're going to be importing a static scene. All of the animations are just going to be ignored. They're not going to come through in the export process. Okay, now Vantage itself is not a tool that is designed to animate complex animations, but you can still use it to animate some pretty cool things. And so that's what we're going to be exploring next year. Okay, so first up, let's talk about camera animations. To do camera animations, you need to basically have multiple cameras in your scene. So what we're gonna do here is we're just gonna, we already have our original camera here. This is this angle that we're looking at right now. And we're just gonna use our viewport to navigate to a different camera angle, I guess sorta like this, okay? And then we're gonna create a new camera with this angle. Okay, we're gonna hit that camera plus icon, and it's going to create our camera one thumbnail here, or it's basically going to create another camera for us. Okay, so then let's also create another camera, but maybe let's have it be facing this sort of direction. Okay, so we're going to create another one. And now we have 3 cameras in our scene. Our original camera, which is this angle, our camera 1, which is this angle, and our camera 2, which is this angle. Now, you've probably seen as I'm switching between these, the transition is animated, right? So we don't just instantly snap to this camera view, we kind of transition into it. And that's going to be the basis for our animation. Now we're going to need to open up the timeline here by clicking on this button, okay? And for our editor settings, we're just going to immediately switch to the shot settings. It's just going to make it a little bit easier to work with things, at least for now, okay? Okay, so at this point, we want to start dropping these cameras onto our camera's animation track here, if you will. So we're just going to take our original camera thumbnail, we're just going to drag it and drop it onto this track. We're going to do the same with camera 1 and same with camera 2. Okay, so now we have 3 different cameras on the camera track here. And as you can see, these transition sort of layers here got created as well. So now if we hit play on our timeline, as you can see, we have a bit of an animation going, right? Pretty dope. But now it's going by super fast, which is really not that optimal, right? So how do we fix that? So we do that by playing with the actual transition layer. So I'm going to select the transition layer. I'm going to right click on it. And I'm going to set the duration for it. Okay, so the duration, I want it to be set to, say, for example, 5 seconds. Then I can hit OK. All right, so now if we hit play, as you can see, for the first 5 seconds, the transition is slow, but then the next transition is super fast. Again, if we hit play, we need 5 seconds to get to camera 1 angle here, and then to camera 2, we transition in 1 second. That is because this second transition layer here, that takes us from camera 1 to camera 2, is again set to 1 second. So we can set this one to, say, for example, 3 seconds here if we wanted to, right? And now we have a bit more of a slower paced transition between all the different cameras. One thing to note here is that currently we are in the shot mode, right? And as you can see, our frames or our animation timing is up here, right? So we've basically have 8 seconds of animation right now. So 5 seconds plus 3 equals the entire timeline, right? And the timeline here is going to adjust automatically based on your shots and your transitions here. So if I set this to, for example, 10 seconds, you can see that now our timeline is going to be 15 seconds long because we have a transition that's 5 seconds and we have a transition that's 10 seconds. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Bottom line here is that you really shouldn't look at this sort of track down here as how long the actual animation is. This here, this field here tells you how long the animation is. But now if you switch the editor settings from shot to time, well, now you can basically see this track become as long as the entire animation is. So if we set this transition back to, say, 3 seconds, for example, as you can see now this track is sort of encompassing the entire sort of time range that we see up here as well. But now we lose the ability to actually see which cameras we have animated here, right? Or between which cameras we're transitioning. These yellow sort of pieces here is basically the node R cameras, right? But so you can see the shot editor here might make it a little bit more clear as to which cameras you're transitioning between, or essentially how you're lining up your shots, right? And then your time editor here is purely focused on the actual time itself. Now, what can you do with these transitions? As we haven't really explored all the different things you can do with them. You can, for example, change their curves, so you can change them to be linear, right? So now the transitions are not going to have an easy ease curve to them. They're just going to have this linear sort of playing style, right? So there is that. And then you can also, if you click, let's maybe go back into the shot mode. If you click on these pluses here on the left or right, you can insert new cameras very quickly this way. Okay, so after this transition or before this transition, etc., etc. And you can also, if you just click on the plus wherever your camera sort of thumbnail is here, if you click on the plus, you can see that you can add a pause as well. Okay, so that's how you can animate transitions between cameras in Vantage. But now let's take a look at how we can animate objects as well. Okay, so we still have our original camera animation here, that we just set up. It's still working exactly as it was before. But now we're gonna try to make sure, we're gonna try to make this statue here move to the other side of the room as we're transitioning between cameras. Okay. So to set that up, we're going to have to go under scene states here. Okay, and we're going to create a new scene state. We're going to call this the statue original position state. Okay, and then we're going to create another scene state, and we're just going to call it the statue moved state, right? Just like that, hit create. And now what we're going to do is when we have this statue moved state selected here, we're going to move our statue, okay, over to the left. It's a simple animation. And now we're going to hit the update button. Okay, so now this scene state updated. And if we switch to the previous one by clicking on it, you can see that the statue moves. Okay, but now if we hit play, nothing really happens. It all kind of depends on the scene state that we are in, right? So things aren't really animated at the moment. The way you animate objects move is you need to do that in conjunction with your cameras. Okay, so we're gonna have our original camera be selected here, and we're gonna give it the statue OG state scene state. Okay, by clicking on this button here and selecting it. Then what we're gonna do is we're gonna select our camera 1 state here, and we're gonna use the statue moved scene state. Okay, so now what happens, you've probably seen it already, when we move between the two cameras, our scene state changes as well. And the scene state is, much like the camera transitions are, it is animated. And so our statue moves, as you can see, right? So now if we just hit play, the statue will move, right? And so that's how you animate things in Vantage. Again, it's not software designed to animate things, but you can still animate stuff if you want to, right? Now, some of you might be wondering, hey, I don't want any cameras to move, but I want my objects to move. So how do I set that up? Well, it's real simple, really. So we're just gonna, we have our original camera here, okay? And we're just gonna make sure that we create another camera from the same angle, okay? So let's call this the, let's have it be called camera 3 angle, okay? So for the camera 3 angle, we want to use the statue moved state, okay? Because the original camera has the statue OG state. So now, as you can see, if we just move between these two cameras, which are positioned exactly the same, but they have different states, well, we still get to see our animation happen, right? So we can now, if we so wanted to, move things around without actually moving the cameras. Now, the whole animation is still tied to this being two different cameras, because we're essentially, again, switching states when we switch between the two cameras. And all of that is a transition. And so that's why the way that we can handle it and the way that we can animate it is the same as we would with cameras. So for example, let's just delete this camera 1 shot here. Okay, right click, delete. And let's also delete the camera 2 shot here. Let's just move in camera 3 angle here. Okay. So now what we can do is, if we hit play, we can just see this animation play out. Now, if we change the transition speed here to say 10 seconds, okay, well, now this scene state transition is going to take 10 seconds. And because our original camera and camera 3 are basically the same angle, well, the cameras are really not transitioning anywhere. And you now just see the statue move essentially. Okay, now, but you can also use a mixed approach. Okay, so for example, you can animate a camera going from camera A to camera B, and then objects move. And so that's what we're gonna showcase next year. The only thing that we changed in our scene right now is that we've changed the scene states that are tied to cameras to none, just so we start from scratch, except for our original camera. It still has its statue OG state. Okay, so now let's also delete everything that's in our camera track here. Okay, and now let's bring in the original camera first, because this is going to be our starting position. And then what we want to do is we want to move to our camera 1 camera angle, and we want this transition to be, lasting 3 seconds, right? Okay, now for camera 1, we don't want anything in the scene to move, any of the objects. We don't want them to move. So for the scene state here, we're going to go with the statue OG state. So the same state that we had in our original camera. So now nothing will move. That statue will not move. Now let's say we want to go back to camera 2, or we want to proceed to camera 2, and this transition will take 3 seconds again. Okay, so now we're moving from our original camera to camera 1 to camera 2. And now let's say we want to go back to our original sort of camera position. Okay, so this camera angle right here. This is essentially the same camera as the camera 3 that we created earlier, right? And so for to get the move to actually happen, we want to drag the camera 3 in to the shot list here. And let's also make it just, let's have it last 3 seconds as well. Okay. So now our camera animation is all set. You know, we're moving from one camera to another, right? Okay, cool. Now, how do we get the statue? What if we wanted to get the statue to move when we're transitioning from camera 2 to camera 3? Well, it's real easy. For camera 2, we want our scene state to be set to statue OG state. And for a camera 3 scene state, we want it to be set to statue moved state. Okay, so now if we kind of break things down here, transition from the original camera to camera 1, we have the statue in its original position. And then from camera 1 to camera 2, our statue is again in the original position, as you can see it. But then when we move to camera 3, our statue is going to move, right? So that's exactly what's happening. So let's just play this animation. So the statue is currently not moving. It's still not moving. Now as we transition to this camera, it will move. You can see it move right here. Okay, and so that's how you do that. Now, again, Vantage isn't really designed to do complex animations, but because this is a fundamental release for us, we're focusing on the fundamentals, moving things from Corona to Vantage. You know, this is probably the approach you would take to animate things in your scenes. Okay, but now we still haven't talked about how we actually output sequences. So let's take a look at that next. So basically how we render out our animations. So to render out this animation, well, you want to click on the render settings here, and then you can switch from still image to sequence, as you can see, right? This menu wasn't available previously because we didn't have any animations in our scene, but it is available now, and the settings here pretty much match the still image settings, with the exception pretty much for this output menu. So here you can decide what the first frame is, what the last frame is, what the FPS is, etc., etc. Okay, so ultimately what you want to do here is you want to set all of these settings up the way you want them to be set, and then you just hit start, and your animation is going to start getting rendered. Yes, Nate's from the future here again. One more thing that we would like to emphasize here is that right now in this specific version of Vantage, we do have an update coming out at the moment that we're recording this, but at this moment in time, Vantage is a little bit peculiar when it comes to calculating your last frame and your FPS numbers here. So right now, if I set my FPS number to 30, for example, right, you're going to be able to see that the last frame will be automatically set to 150. And that makes sense because we have 30 frames per second and the actual animation is 5 seconds long, which is 150 frames, right? Now, if we go back and we set the duration to something like, I don't know, 10 seconds, hit OK, go back to the render menu. As you can see, these numbers will be off a little bit. So again, you want to set your FPS back to what you want it to be. And you also want to make sure that your last frame here is set correctly. So, you know, if you have 30 FPS and you have 10 seconds long animation, you're going to end on frame 300. So just always, you know, a bit of a friendly advice, always try and make sure that these numbers do line up with the animation that you're trying to render out. Okay, so with that, we covered some of the major topics that we really wanted to cover in this sort of overview tutorial. We do still have some individual topics that we want to discuss here, and so that's what we're going to be focusing on next year. Okay, so let's first talk about all the export buttons here. But in order to understand how they work, we kind of need to understand how the whole export process in a way works, okay? So right now, the attempt that we showcased here was by the exporting attempt was done using this button right here, export scene button. All right, and what we did, if you remember, was we exported a V-Ray scene file. Okay, so this is that file. And then what we did was we opened up Vantage, right, and we loaded that file in essentially. Okay, so what you need to understand here is that basically Vantage is referencing that VR scene file. Okay, it's referencing it, And then any changes you make to it in Vantage, it gets saved in the Vantage file format. Okay, so what we have to do then here is, once we're done with making all the relevant adjustment to the scene in Vantage, what we need to do is we need to go under File and save the scene as a Vantage file. Okay, so we can just, in this example, we can just call it the Vantage file. Okay, and now, as you can see, we have a Vantage file and we have a VR scene file. And as you can see, the Vantage file is really small, and that is because Vantage is essentially, if you think about it like in DCC terms, it's basically referencing the VR scene file at all times, right? And then it basically just saves all the changes that you made to the scene in Vantage. Okay, because those changes aren't really relevant to the VR scene file itself. They're just relevant to, you know, your Vantage application, if you will. Now, this also means you can make changes to your scenes in 3ds Max. So in our case here, we're just going to make a trivial change. Okay, we're going to create a new box object. Okay, and we're going to re-export the scene as a VR scene file. So just like this. Okay, and we're just gonna hit yes. So we're overwriting it. We're obviously gonna give it a minute to do all the calculations and do all the export magic. And so now that the export is done, what we're gonna do here is we're gonna make some trivial changes to our scene here. We're just gonna move this statue a bit to the left. Maybe we're gonna move this chair to the middle of the room, something like this. Okay. And now what we're gonna do is we're gonna save these changes into the, into the Vantage file itself that we created earlier. And now we're just gonna reload the scene. Okay. And now Vantage is gonna, again, read the VR scene file. It's gonna reload it. And it's also, because we saved everything in a Vantage file, it's also going to load all the changes we made in Vantage. So now, as you can see, we have that box in our scene, right? It's missing materials, but we have that box in the scene, but we also see that all of our objects that we moved in Vantage are still here. So this is how you can update your scenes and still work in them in Vantage, right? Now, one important thing to note here is that if, for example, we apply, let's apply one of these random materials to our box here, okay? If we do this and if we save the Vantage file, okay, now if we go back into 3ds Max and we rename our box here, so let's call it box, let's just call it something random, okay? And if we now re-export the scene, okay, so we made some changes to our box and we're gonna re-export it, okay? So we're gonna overwrite the scene, gonna give it time to do the export process, right? Well, now if we go back into Vantage and reload the scene in here, okay, just like we did earlier, you're gonna be able to see that our box will not have a material applied to it anymore. So let's just wait for the scene to reload. And as you can see, the material is not applied to our box anymore. That is because the name of the box changed. And so everything, all the changes that you make in Vantage are tied to object names in your scene. Okay, and the same goes for the materials as well. So you want to make sure that if you're making changes in Vantage to materials, assigning them, or if you're making changes to objects, animating them, or just moving them around, and the same goes for lights as well, you want to make sure that they have the same name. Otherwise, the changes you made in Vantage won't really be registered, because everything is name based. Now, on top of that, obviously, if you make changes to your objects, to your lights, to your materials inside Vantage, right, you can't really move those changes back into your DCC, back into the VR scene file. Okay, so now that we understand that, we can go back to our little buttons here and talk a little bit more about them. So they all export the scene for you, but then they do things just a little bit differently, okay? So up to this point, the way that we exported our scene was with the export scene button. And as the name suggests, all that this button does, it exports the scene for you. So the way that we exported it was we chose the V-Ray scene file format here. Okay, and this is then ultimately the file that we ended up with once the export finished, right? So this is this approach. Now, you also have the ability to export your scene with the Chaos Vantage option here. Okay, so if you go this route, let's just call this thing the Vantage export option. Okay, if you go down this route and hit save, what will ultimately happen here is that you're going to end up with a VR scene file and a pre-made Vantage file. Okay, so let's just give this export a minute to finish exporting here. And now the export is complete. As you can see in our folder, we now have our Vantage export option VR scene file and a Vantage export option Vantage file. So the difference here is just in the fact that one creates a Vantage file for you automatically while the other option doesn't. Okay, so that's the only difference. Now let's move on to the next button here, which is the export plus render button. As the name suggests, this basically exports the scene for you. So you only have the ability to choose the Vantage file. It exports the scene for you, and it automatically will start up Vantage, and it's automatically going to open up the newly created Vantage file. Now do note that this does not just create a single Vantage file. It obviously needs that reference file, so it will also create a VR scene file as well. So let's just demo this. So let's call this export render. Okay, hit save, and let's also then wait for the export to finish here. And we're back just before the export has finished exporting. And so what you're going to see happen here is that we end up with a export render Vantage file and a VR scene file. So all of that is there. But then also in the background here, what happened for me was that Vantage automatically opened up for me. So let me just scoot it over here. And as you can see, it's still starting up. And there we go. We're in action, right? So this is basically what this button right here does. It exports the scene. So you end up with a VR scene file as always. And you also end up with a Vantage file. And then that automatically gets opened up for you. Okay. Cool. Then last but not least, we have this render in Vantage button. So if you just click on this button, you're not going to be greeted by a save dialog. It's just going to start exporting the scene. And you're ultimately, again, going to end up with a VR scene file and a Vantage file. But this time it's just automatically going to get saved in your main directory where your Max file is located at. So you can see this temp folder for now because the export is still in progress. And what's going to happen here is it's going to automatically export everything into our Max folder here, and then Vantage is going to automatically start, and we're going to be able to work directly in Vantage. So it's essentially like a shortcut button to just, you know, save the scene into the main directory and start up Vantage and open up the scene. Essentially, this is what this button does. And hopefully with that, we've dispelled what all of these three buttons here do. Now, another thing that we should mention here that we haven't quite mentioned up until this point is that you can also animate your lights, okay? And animating lights, it's much the same as animating your cameras moving or your objects moving, etc., etc. So let's just demo the workflow here just in case, okay? So we have this light right here, and we have these two cameras, so camera 1 and camera 2. Camera 2 is basically a close-up of camera 1, okay? So now, let's just say we wanted to, as we get closer, as we move into our camera 2, we wanted to animate the color of this light, okay? So what we're gonna do here is we're just going to create a new scene state. So this is going to be the scene state where our light is at its default sort of setup. So we're gonna call the scene state default light. We just wanna make sure that it's updated. And then we're gonna tie it to our camera 1, right? So pretty familiar workflow at this point. And then for our camera 2 scene state, right? Well, we're gonna make changes to our light. So let's just change the light color here to, I don't know, something maybe kind of like this. Okay, we're being creative. Let's just call it that. Okay. Anyhow, with those changes made, we're gonna create a new scene state, and we're gonna call this scene state the updated light scene state. Not really all that creative, but hey. Let's make sure that it's updated. And now let's tie it to our camera 2, right? Now, when we switch between the two, as you can see, the light is going to animate itself, right? It's just going to change from that original sort of default light to this sort of updated light, right? And now at this point, what you can do is you can start creating animations by dragging things onto the little tracks down here. And now, as you can see, we've animated our light source. All right, okay, so what we're going to be exploring next here is how you can animate the sun, okay, because the sun has its own track here, and it animates a little bit differently than the rest of the things that we just showcased. So to animate the sun, you first obviously need to be under the environment tab here, because this is where all your sun settings live. And the first thing that you're going to want to do here, if you want to animate the sun, is you're going to want to change the sun position mode. So you want to change it from manual to animated geolocation. So it kind of gets cut off here, but this is what we want to click on, the animated geolocation. Now this is going to give you a different, I guess you could argue, more calendar-based controls over your sun. But the point here is that you're going to want to first set your start key, so the starting position for your sun, and then you're going to want to set the end key, so the sort of the final position of the sun in your in the animated move that it's going to do. Okay, and now the things that are going to get animated are the highlighted things you see here, the highlighted parameters, so day, month, year, and hours and minutes here. Okay, so for us here, what we're going to do is we're just going to set the start key for the current position of the sun. Oh, actually, before we do that, let's just maybe play with the north offset just so we see more of the sun in our scene. Okay, so set the start key, right? This is going to be the starting position for our sun. And then we just play with these parameters here to get it to a point to where, you know, it's set to where we want it to be at the end of the animation. All right, so once we're happy with the sun's position, set end key. And now, as you can see in our track here, we have a 10-second sun animation that's just, you know, that's just waiting to be played. So we're going to hit the play button. And as you can see, the sun now gets animated. It goes from that starting position to that end position, right? Okay, now how do you control the duration of this animation? Well, you just click, or you right click on the sun animation track here. You click the set duration button, and then you can play around with the duration length. Now, if you want to have the sun animation be played as you're making camera moves and such, the workflow is kind of, you know, as you would expect it to be. So what we got here is our original camera. We're just going to very quickly create another one. So I guess let's go with this camera angle. Okay. And now we just throw these two cameras onto our camera track here. Maybe we up the duration of this move to 10 seconds so that it matches the duration of the sun animation. And now if we just hit play, as you can see, our camera moves and our sun moves. And so that, in a nutshell, is how you animate your sun in Vantage. All right, next up, we're going to be taking a look at scene substates. This is really useful functionality. And up to this point, we've only worked with our sort of main scene states, right? So these guys right here. But then each scene state can have different substates, okay, for the different parts of the scene. So your environment can be in a different scene substate. Your lights can be in a different scene substate. And the same goes for objects, materials, and your post settings or your color correction settings right here. Okay, and so this makes it really a lot easier to work with setting up different variations for the different parts of your scenes without having to go in and create different sort of these global scene states, if you will. And it also makes animating things a little bit easier because you can very quickly switch between the different variations. Okay. So this is going to make a bit more sense once we start exploring it. So let's just do that. Let's go into the environment tab because we're going to be playing with our environment scene substates here to demo the functionality. And so what we're going to do first here is we're going to create a new scene substate. We're going to call this scene substate the sun animated a scene substate. We're going to update it. And for this one, we're going to set up a bit of an animation again. So this is, let's just go with this as our start key. Then let's move the sun around, I guess, sort of like this. And this is going to be our end key. Okay, let's update this substate. Let's hit play just so we can see how the sun moves, right? Pretty cool. All right, so that's our sun animated a scene substate. But now let's say we want to come up, we want to try a different sun animation here. So what we're going to do is we're going to create another scene substate and we're going to call this one sun animated B substate, right? We're going to update it again. And now let's just change the north offset here and let's set this as our start key. And then this is going to be our end key, for example. Okay, let's update the scene substate. This is very important. You need to keep updating these as you make changes. And now if we hit play, obviously we have a different sun animation, right? So now if we quickly want to go back and try the other sun animation, because we're trying to make creative decisions here, we can just switch to the previous scene substate and we're back to the previous sun animation. Okay, right. So then if we go back into our scene states, what we can now do is, right, we can have our scene state A here, and for it, we can kind of decide with this tab here if we want to have the environment state or the environment substate to be our sun animated A substate or our sun animated B substate without having to change or update the entire sort of global scene state, right? So hopefully you can already see the usefulness of scene substates here. In case you don't, however, let's try to spice things up a little bit more here, okay? So what if we actually want to change some materials in our scene here, just to try out different things, to have different variations of our scene, right? So we can do that. Let's go into our in our materials here, under our materials, we're going to create a new scene substate, okay? And this one is actually going to be called the option A scene substate. Okay, this is sort of the original one. We're going to have it be the original one. And then we're going to have another option, which is going to be option B scene substate for our materials. We're going to update this one as well, but this one is actually going to have this black material instead of that marble material on all of these sort of marbly parts. So let's update the scene substate. And now if we go back to our state tab here, scene state tab, you can see that we can now, let's just maybe reset the camera here. We can now choose which material options we want for our scene state A. So maybe we like option B. No. Maybe we like option A, right? Maybe we like option B, but with the sun animated A, right? So as you can see, this then becomes a lot more sort of manageable, right? And it really gives you more control over the way you set up your scene states, especially when you start combining things with the sort of the broader changes that you make in each and every one of your sort of global scene states, right? Plus, you can obviously also do things like, for example, you have your B scene state, right? And so for your A scene state, maybe you can go with the sun animated A and the material state option B. So we're gonna update this scene state here with these substates, okay? And for our B option here, what we're going to do is we're going to go with, say, sun animated B and option A for our materials. And we're going to update this thing accordingly. So now we can very easily switch between all the different, variations of our scene. That said, there is one important thing to note here, and that is that you can't really animate between the different scene substates. Okay, so for example, just as a wild example, okay, if we wanted to take our statue here and we wanted to move it, so we're going to create a new scene substate, moved statue. Okay, we take our statue and we just move it to a different position, update the scene substate. Okay, and if we now go back into our, let's say, our A substate, and we want our object state to be set to moved state, and in our B state, we want it to be set to the original scene one. Okay. And if we now go into, for example, our cameras, we set this one to be set to scene state A and this one to scene state B. Well, now what you're going to be able to see is that scene substates won't really be animatable. So our statue didn't move, our materials don't change from option A to option B, and our sun is still, our sun animated A option. So essentially the starting scene state of the animation is going to be the one that's going to get played through the animation. So again, scene substates can't really be animated. But that doesn't mean that scene substates can be useful to you when you're trying to animate things. So if for example, right, you're trying to try different sun animations for the different, global scene states that you have, this can be really useful then to try out different variations for them, etc., etc. All right, now what we're going to be taking a look at next year is this neat feature that Vantage has to load up existing Vantage scenes as configuration scenes, essentially. Okay, so we were working in this scene. It's based on that original VR scene export that we did at the beginning of this tutorial. And as you can see, we made quite a few changes to our scene here. So we've added a bunch of cameras in here. We even have some scene states here that are animated. So as you can see, this statue is sort of animated to move. And we also have some scene substates to have this, black and white color correction applied everywhere, etc., etc. Right? So a lot of work has been put into this scene. But now for example, let's just say that, we go back to our DCC and we start making big changes to our scene. So we start adding new objects in, we delete some of the old ones, we modify some of the old ones, etc., etc. So in that case, you might want to re-export that modified scene into a new VR scene file, like we did here. So we have that original modern interior export VR scene file, and then we have this modern interior export modified VR scene file, right? And so if we want to work in that new modified scene, we can just open it up, right? And it's gonna take like a couple of seconds to open it up because I guess it is a fairly complex scene. So we have it open now. We can even save this file as a new Vantage file. So we can call it Vantage. We'll just call the Vantage modified export scene file, right? And as you can see, things have been moved around here. We have new objects in here. I mean, just, the dining room looks different, etc., etc. But the problem that we have right now is that this scene is mostly the same, I guess, for the most part. But we don't have any of our existing cameras in here. We don't have any of our existing animations or scene states in here even. And, we don't have that black and white look and all that. But what we can do now here is we can go under File, Open Scene as Config Only, and we can point at that original Vantage file that we were working in and hit Open. And as soon as we do that, look at that. We are back with our sort of original Vantage configuration that we had in that original Vantage scene, right? So as you can see, we are in this new scene now, right? In this modified, updated scene, but we still have our animation here, right? So if we hit play, that statue still moves, and we have our scene states, we have our color corrections, our scene substates, and all of our cameras. All that is now in this new modified scene, right? And so that's really neat and useful functionality. Now, one thing to note here, and we already talked about this earlier in the tutorial, but whenever you're updating your scenes in your DCC and then updating the VR scene files or re-exporting new VR scene files, right, of existing scenes, you got to pay attention to the fact that, if you want this statue, for example, to move, it still needs to have the same name when you re-export it, when you update it into DCC, because everything is sort of tied to the names of the objects. And the same goes to, for example, if you changed this marble top material in Vantage, you changed it to a different type of a material, right, in Vantage, well then if you're re-exporting the scene or updating the scene, you got to make sure that this object then still has the same name. Otherwise, these changes won't be applied to the objects. We already talked about this, but just mentioning it just in case again. Now, before we go ahead and we conclude this tutorial, just a bit of a note, a piece of advice, or however you want to put it. Chaos Vantage is a real-time renderer, right? And so obviously that's a completely different render engine than say Corona, than say V-Ray, etc., etc. So that's important to know because it is such a different render engine. Certain functionality from Corona, from V-Ray, is just not supported. Okay, and so it's wise to always go over on docs.chaos.com and just check out the supported features and just get acquainted with what Vantage can do and what it can't do. Because it is a real-time render engine. It works differently than offline render engines such as, again, Corona, V-Ray, and the like. Okay, and so that's pretty much it for this tutorial. Again, with Corona 12, we are introducing sort of this fundamental support for exporting Corona scenes into Vantage. We don't support animations and some other, more intricate things. We do plan on working on getting those to be supported as well. So we really hope you've learned something new here. We hope you got acquainted with Vantage. We hope you see an opportunity to use Vantage in your workflow if it fits. And obviously, we also hope that you now know about some of the limitations and things that we will still be working on improving, as we develop new versions of Corona. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next one.